I'm David Theo Goldberg. I direct the University of California Humanities Research Institute and the MacArthur Digital Media and Learning Research Hub, based here at UC Irvine. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the opening of the Reclaim Open Learning day and a half or so. And a pleasure to have with us a number of notable people. I'm going to start just by issuing a series of thank yous, our deep gratitude to a number of people and supporters. So first, the MacArthur Foundation and Connie Yao, whose funding, of course, and leadership has made this possible. She can't be here with us today, but she, all I know, is watching us online. This is part of the ongoing DML initiative and produced by the Research Hub. And so this event would not be happening without the support of the MacArthur Foundation. I want to thank Cal IT2, in whose living room we sit. It's a great pleasure that they are partnering with us in this venture and made possible. I'll turn it over to GPD in just a moment to say a few words of welcome. And I want to thank my colleagues at the DML Research Hub, Mimi Ito, and the staff, but also especially those who've worked with us together to put this together. Anya Kamenetz, who's sitting here, Philip Schmidt, who's sitting over there, Liz Loesch, who's sitting at the back, and of course Mimi and myself. Between us, we sort of have crafted this event, so we hope it's something that will make some indent in the discussion. So I just want to, before I say a few very brief opening remarks, I want to introduce GP Lee, who is the Irvine Division Director of the California Institute for Telecommunications and Technology. He holds professorships in pretty much every division of engineering on this campus. And yeah, has a very long profile, which I'm not going to bore you with, even though it's well worth going to look up. So GP Lee, without further ado.
Thank you. I would like to extend warm welcome to all of you to come to UCI, and especially KIT2. This is a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. And we are so proud to be part of this success of this symposium. And this time, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of you for coming to this event at the evening. I know it's usually this is a family time. And your participation, allowing us to exchange information, idea with you is very valuable to us. Also, I'd like to thank our distinguished speaker, the keynote speaker, Professor John Seeley Brown. He was a professor at the UCI many years ago. And he was KIT2 advisory board member. And over the years, he gave us many inspirational suggestions and direction about research topics. And I have learned so much from him over the years, and gave me so many advice. And you can see that this is one of the topics he has been educating me, and so important to us to understand a different part of the society, how we can bring society together. And lastly, I'd like to thank the leadership of Professor Dave Goldberg, and he is the one to really bring everyone together to have this symposium. And his leadership and really transform how we really work on this cultural piece. And if you allow me to have 1 minute to make an elevator pitch about our institutes, as Dave was talking about, is KIT2 stands for California Institute for Telecommunication and Information Technology. So our mission is not only to research and develop information and communication technology, but also to explore their use for digital transformation of energy, healthcare, environments, and cultures. So this is open learning is one of the example topic in this digital transformation of cultures. So that's why I believe I will enjoy listening to all the conversation this evening as tomorrow. I can participate most of the talk, I will. And thank you, allowing me to be part of this successful program. Welcome to UCI.
Thank you, GP Lee. Just a very quick word about how this came to pass in terms of the concerns and ideas with which we found ourselves confronted. I mean, there's obviously been a great deal that has happened under the banner of online or digital learning over the past couple of decades. And in particular, over the last year, the impact of digital technology on educational provision has been widely discussed, not least in relation to the intervention of what I've come to call in publication MOOC mania over the last 18 or so months, certainly the last year. We were increasingly concerned at the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub that the conversation was around digital media and education was really being driven by technology. And we have long been committed to the idea and understanding that, that it's learning that should be driving our conception of the undertaking in relation to technological development. So it's the learning that drives technological invention, or should be driving technological invention. What makes for good learning rather than the technology which drives the kind of educational possibility, right? Or in some cases delimits educational possibility. So we wanted to come back to our founding principles, so to speak, and bring together a conversation around what it would take for technology to be driven by learning rather than learning to be driven by technology. And hence our undertaking to bring together some of the key people thinking about the set of concerns with which we've been engaged these past few years. So without further ado, and in that spirit, I'd like to call on Anya Kamenetz to introduce our evening's conversationists around these topics. You'll know Anya Kamenetz as a contributing writer of Fast Company magazine and the author of any number of books dealing with the future of education and, in our terms, the future of learning, including learning freedom and the web, and the EduPunk's Freedom, published as ebooks by Mozilla, and so on. So again, without further ado, please welcome Anya Kamenetz and our panel. Thank you.
Hi. Do you want me to go up to the podium and introduce everyone, or just sit here? Okay. Hi, welcome. I cannot believe that we're actually here. This has been the outcome of so many interesting conversations and Google Hangouts and crazy email threads and even some Twitter threads. So, you know, we're going to be here for this brief physical convening and then go back out to our stations in the world and hopefully continue the conversation from there. And are we actually live streaming too? Hello out there in internet land. So I'm really, really thrilled to be a part of this. As a journalist, I am a professional amateur and always out there asking questions and trying to find out what's going on, and to be invited into the blessed circle of practitioners and theorists and people who really, you know, think so deeply about these things for such a long time, and people that are out there prototyping and making things happen, is a really exciting position for me. But enough about me. I'm here to facilitate the conversation between these two thinkers. And to my right, obviously, is JSB, who should need no introduction. My introduction to him was through his book, The Power of Pool, which has been really transformational for me in my thinking about how knowledge and everything else is organized in the modern age, or sometimes disorganized. And then to his right is Amin Saberi, who is a professor of management science and computational engineering and mechanical engineering.
No, computational science.
Computational, okay, at Stanford. And since the mid-March, also an entrepreneur for the first time, starting NovoEd, which is, by my count, the third major MOOC platform to come out of Stanford University. And focusing, however, on a very interesting variation on the theme of the MOOC. And I'm going to ask him, actually, just to describe what NovoEd does and how it does it, and what he's responding to in the transition toward MOOCs or open learning. I know from our conversations earlier that you did have sort of a conversion experience into realizing what the possibilities are of this moment, which I think a lot of people have done, but then it's moved very quickly also into realizing some of the limitations of the traditional MOOC, of the year-old traditional MOOC. So tell me about how you came to what you're doing now.
Right. So hello. Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for including me in your community. I don't know many people here, but someone told me that I should expect. Sort of said. She said if you can't find friendly people in an open learning community, there is no hope for any other. So I'm looking forward to meeting and talking to a lot of you. So I'm actually, sort of a computer scientist by training, and I have entered this space of online learning somewhat accidentally, in a sense that I have been studying online social networks and sort of in intersection of social sciences and computer sciences and how people interact in online environments for the past 6 or 7 years. But my entrance into the world of online learning happened because I ran into a colleague who wanted to teach a course online. The course was on entrepreneurship, and he was looking for sort of the right technology to offer his course. And he was a little bit disillusioned by the solutions that was sort of offered to him. In the sense that there are a lot of let's call them MOOC platforms out there that are great for mastery learning. In the sense that to deliver lectures and sort of multiple choice questions to the student until he or she masters a particular topic or a skill set. But entrepreneurship is not taught that way. Right? He told me he couldn't find the right multiple choice question that would test whether you're an entrepreneur. So I asked him how you teach a course, let's say on campus in a Stanford class. He told me, well, no, that's very different, very experiential. I get the students to form teams. Each team work on their own project. They come give presentations. They get feedback from me, from mentors, from their peers. And I thought, well, let's try to do that online. And initially my commitment to him was very limited. It was I and one of my students who actually, became one of the co-founders of NovoEd. We committed 8 days, 4 weekends to him. I said, we'll put together something quickly for you so you can get the class going. We put actually a website together, students started signing up, and we would show them, thank you. And that was the whole site. And then, but what happened was that, 80,000 people signed up for this course from all around the world, from 150 different countries. There were people who were very experienced entrepreneurs, serial entrepreneurs, billionaires in this course.
Billionaires?
Billionaires, yeah, I shouldn't name, but all the way to, there were this,
funding.
Yeah, there you go. Accra, Ghana, students who didn't have internet access at home or at school. They had to go to an internet cafe to submit their homeworks. Very diverse group of people. There were a group of women from my home country, Iran, working on an entrepreneurial project. There was a woman from Saudi Arabia who was working with a bunch of guys outside Saudi Arabia. Very energetic, very enthusiastic folks. So, we started by helping them form teams. The teams started working on their own projects, from, social networks to mobile technologies to healthcare, you name it. And some of them found mentors. We got, hundreds of people signing up as mentors. The top teams, we helped them pitch to a venture capitalist. Some of them got funding. Some of them are now real companies. In Bolivia, we have companies in Chile, Bolivia, US, Germany, India, and Malaysia that sort of started from that course. Many of them are now hiring. What started as a little project for me, or maybe a course for my colleague, close to the end of it felt more like a social movement. And we thought, this is how a class should be. At the end of it, there were a lot of my colleagues who came to me and said, we want to teach our course like that. And then, sort of said, what does it mean? What did we do right? And that, sort of brings me to, what you guys knew before I even got into this, that in this transition from brick and mortar to online learning, you shouldn't strip away the social, the experiential, or collaborative aspects of learning. We can actually use the power of the social web to amplify this, to open new doors, to make new things happen. So since then, we have been offering a lot of courses. Some of them are open courses that anybody can take. Many of them are actually on-campus courses or, sort of professional education courses that are open. Some of them are open but not free. But it's been quite a ride since then. So that's the little thing about the sort of NovoEd and how it got started.
I mean, I find that, by the way, fantastic, because you also find that most courses in universities, face-to-face courses, don't know how to teach entrepreneurialism.
Right.
So in a way, you actually, in the space that you were given, you had a chance to kind of break new paradigms and explore possibilities. So let me just mention a couple that you talked about that really strike me as fantastic. The first is, if you listen to a pitch, as a VC or as a venture or angel funding in my case, it's not so much the quality of the pitch that really matters, it's the quality of the team.
Mm-hmm.
And you actually think that that team can do amazing things together.
Right.
Okay? And so right away, that what you were doing in your course is getting these kids to figure out how to discover, select in, select out, construct a team, and then construct a kind of a sense of identity across that project. And you're well down the path toward being able to make a successful pitch. And that's very hard to teach. You create a context that starts to emerge.
Right.
And then the beautiful thing, what you're doing, and what we're being able to see is coming over here, in fact, as well, is you got a lot of peer criticism happening. In a peer-based learning, you learn as much from others as you do from the authority.
Right.
Your particular case is not necessarily an authority in entrepreneurialism. It's a question really of how well can you learn from each other, which now has to do with not how do you criticize each other, but how do you critique?
Right.
And there's a very subtle difference, as a writer. The whole catch is, how can I say something that gets you to think beyond where you are now? It's easy to make you look like an idiot. And I used to think that was my job as a professor, to ask the killer question, to see if I could kind of completely destroy the speaker. And after a while, I started to grow up and began to realize, no, can you actually pose a question that changes the thinking a little bit, that they can move on beyond the point that they may be stuck at. And I love the way you're approaching this, because these are the skills that actually do underlie successful entrepreneurialism. The one question I'd ask is, the other thing that I find key is listening.
Right.
How do you actually listen with humility? You know that as a journalist, better than any, but I mean, and it's kind of curious, how do you actually think about structuring your teams, or what kind of advice can you get people? Is it that there's a kind of listening as much to what is not being said as to what is being said? And you do that all the time. It's we're taught to listen to what is said,
Right.
but let me tell you, what's not being said is almost always where the information lies. And,
Right.
And how do you bring that out in your context? Have you looked at that?
Right. No, so we actually, so for example, one of the challenges was that, when you get, I think we have around 70,000, 80,000 PowerPoint presentations, sort of uploaded around 10,000 business models. And when you have that many, you can't really get the instructor to look at them. So we try to
They're all the same, they go like this.
Right. We try to teach the students to give each other constructive feedback. Right? So, first, there was this discussion about how do you actually evaluate a submission, and then we asked them to look at each other's submission and give each other feedback. And one thing is sort of this is some of the things about the learning that I thought, I have to force the students to do this. So it was started by thinking, if you like to get 5 feedbacks, you have to give 5 feedbacks to 5 different people. And we try to create this proportionality. And I was, for the first few weeks, I was looking at the data. And then at some point I looked at somebody had given 70, 80 feedbacks to people. And then we can actually look at the time, how much time it took, and how many characters. And I started looking at this, and they were actually very high quality, very thoughtful. So I wrote to him and said, why did you do this? And then, he took, they wrote back, and I have the email, that this part, that actually looking at other people's work, thinking about what they have proposed, was the more important part of the learning for that person. So now I look at my assignment, look at what I submitted, and I'm much more objective about it. And I'm actually getting a lot more ideas. So it's actually, part of the learning.
Right, it's almost learning from the adjacencies. Yeah.
You guys are getting into design specs very quickly, which is great. And I think, specifications.
Go ahead, take over.
Well, no, and definitions of learning, which are, I think part of what we're trying to do here is problematize the concept of learning and the idea that learning and education are the same thing. But what's not being said, right, is you mentioned this feeling of teaching a course that suddenly becomes a social movement. And I think that for many of us, we cherish the notion of education, learning as a social movement, and it doesn't feel that way in the traditional system. There's something missing to that. And I wonder, what the future of this, of the provision of this of learning and the experience of learning is going to be, assuming that it doesn't happen that way within the traditional structure. Or maybe you think that it will happen within the traditional structure, but you've certainly taken a step outside it. And you've been looking at it from the outside and the inside for a very long time.
It's curious to me because, in an interesting way, communities of interest, all they do is learn from each other.
Right.
And in some ways, that's why these communities of interest are so powerful.
Right.
And if you look at the, even in the movements around Harry Potter, and what is going on behind the scenes, if you look at what I know a little bit more about World of Warcraft, consider the fact that potentially 10 to 15,000 new ideas a night are being created that have to be absorbed for high-end raid behavior the next day. How do they actually understand that? Why do you have a guild? How does it self-organize into groups that actually test the ideas out? It is an amazing learning community. And I like to think that, the game itself isn't that important, but it's the social life around the edge of that game is what really matters, which is very much of a learning space. And some of us in this room are, both you and I and others here, you just go back to the open source code movement. Look at Linux. I don't know about you, but when I was first taught how to allegedly program, and I was delivered information how to do this, sitting in a room 3 times this size. It wasn't that much fun, and you more or less learned it because you had to. And there was a sense of, if you wanted to always be a macho guy, most of us were guys back then, this is a long time ago, what you would try to do is write a piece of code that worked, but it was so obscure that no one could figure it out, And that was hero status. Okay, now move into the open source, Linux world, which is fundamentally a learning community. Okay, the person who writes code that's not meant to be read is read out of the community very, very fast. And so the whole purpose of what we do is we write code for others to look at, to improve, to help us learn as well, so on and so forth. And so all of a sudden, we now have this incredibly scalable way of learning the practice, not the theory, the practice of certain kinds of coding and design paradigm, and so on, by this way. Totally scalable, totally social, and all driven by the motivation of helping each other get better. And that's the kind of thing that, to me, this marked a huge chasm between classical education of being taught, and I mean, albeit dramatic story that sense, versus what now happens all the time. And now part of what you see in the open education resource movement is how do you take that spirit of how do we help each other break new grounds, how do we improve each other, how do you actually now write for other people to learn from, not as a professor but as a peer learner. It becomes fascinating.
I want to follow up with you on that, but I also want to ask, I mean, in concrete terms, dealing with the issue of learning happens in open communities in this wonderful way. What was it like for you to make that decision to step outside of the institution and start your own enterprise? Why did you choose to do it that way? What kind of compromises do you make, frankly, to go into a space where you have to deal with funding and a commercial structure? And what are the trade-offs there?
Right. One of the reasons we spun the project out of, the primary reason we spun the project out of Stanford was that it was growing very quickly. In the sense that, you have to hire more people and, our department or any other department was not, designed in such a way that, if you double every 2 weeks, they can, accommodate that, facilitate that. There were a lot of regulations that we were, testing. And in a sense, when we started working with other universities, there was this question of, whether this is going to be offered under, like one university offering the course under a different university's brand, or, and then, when you see that many lawyers in one room, you decide you got to do it in a different way. So it was out of necessity, and I think this is to the credit of Stanford culture that has made this very easy, in the sense that if you have a good idea and you'd like to try it in the outside world, they actually help you with the licensing of the technology, and being in Silicon Valley definitely helps. In terms of how it changed, personally, the biggest difference for me was that after a while I realized I better deliver, because now there are people who are, counting on their paychecks, and it's no longer, when you're a faculty member, if you forget something or if you don't do it, it's almost cute. Like nobody, it's part of the, but now, as an entrepreneur, I have to take things a lot more seriously. I'm responsible to funders. I'm responsible to my, employees and to, hundreds of thousands of students. So that was probably the biggest change.
So the reasons you had to go it alone: scale, regulations and lawyers, and actually accountability directly to the people that you're serving.
Right.
What's the role for the traditional institution, given those challenges, in responding to the kinds of forces and the kinds of organizations that you describe so well?
Well, I'm not quite sure I understand the question. I mean, the open source course scales exponentially, so there's no issue there. And doesn't take any money.
Right.
Okay, so that's a slightly easier game to know how to play. What I find beautiful, the way you were describing this, is when you have this kind of, exponential demand, you can't possibly do it in a linear organization.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And universities are fundamentally linear, are super linear, but nevertheless linear. So you found a way to break out of that, and I find it, of course, very interesting that the 3, commercial MOOCs all came out of Stanford, which all had I might call it the determined spirit in the School of Engineering, that said, let's get out there in the real world and try an idea out as fast as we can to actually bring theory and practice together. And that's kind of what, I find the elegance of what you're doing. And it's, interesting, I believe we'll see, and your approach, Sebastian's approach, Udacity and Coursera, are already, even in a very short period of time, going in curiously different directions.
Right.
So, so you're actually getting to explore a pretty interesting space out here, as long as people are willing to step back and reflect honestly. And I think that's what I hope that all three of the groups do, because the learnings that you're having, and I think it's, you mentioned that Coursera sometimes, well, I mean, both Coursera and Udacity also mentioned it, but one of the reasons why this is so phenomenally interesting is when you have 100,000 students or more.
Right.
First of all, by the way, that says that there's an unbelievable hunger for learning. We ought to come back to that at some point, because because that's real learning. That's not going to get a certificate. That's learning, in some deeper sense of the word. But the ability to now collect data to advance a theory of learning is phenomenal. And in fact, as soon as you started talking about one of your things, I'm already going to run after you when you leave and say, hey, let's do the following measurement, because it's very interesting to study how collaborative groups, how they split their time, who dominates, under what conditions, and so on and so forth. And what you find is if you can actually make fine-grained measurements,
Right.
you can actually tune the effectiveness of the team. But we're only now beginning to collect, data off maybe 1 million teams to be able to show exactly how to tune the performance of a team to get kind of, expert performance out of that team.
Right.
And now we can start to, to collect that kind of data. So we may actually be able to bring a science of learning, not just, quote unquote, a study of teaching.
That is so interesting and important, and it links back to what David said in the introduction, which is, he talked about the idea of having, learning guiding the technology rather than technology guiding the learning. It's a little bit different from what you're saying, I think, because this is sort of this is a relentlessly kind of techno-centric view of this technology will obviously open up our understanding of learning, the opportunities.
Right. But what it really is, and Dave gave one polar possibility.
Right.
But all, let me add all science, I was going to say all learning, but sorry, but almost all science advances through new tools.
Okay, right.
Okay? And what I'm really saying is we have unbelievably powerful new tools
Right.
to advance our understanding of learning.
Right.
And the ability to tune material. I think we're going to be able to collapse the time of learning by knowing how to tune material, tune students' responses, but actually, my guess is even more so, tune the way the social groups work.
Right, absolutely. So we are actually learning quite a bit about what student profiles are better matches for each other.
Right.
We are trying to, sort of an algorithm for guessing who's going to show up. Right? That was one of our early problems, that, you would match 5 students to each other, 3 of them wouldn't show up. So that 2 more committed, would even be a little. So we are getting better and better at that to see, for sort of, which 5 people, sort of you should match with each other so that they, and then at the end, we have a much better idea of who did what kind of work.
Right.
This was actually for a lot of team projects on campus, I had this problem that, it would be 5 people give a presentation. You had kind of a guess that, maybe like she did all the job. But you had no way of actually, telling this for sure, or having this reflected in the grade. Now we can actually see a lot of this.
It's a fantastic point, because if you actually go out, I did some evaluation with Dan Atkins on open education resources a few years ago. You go out and you actually start looking at how well people like to do collaborative learning. By and large, they hate it.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, how do you select in, how much time is spent, But one of the biggest problems is free riders. And how do you handle a free rider problem? Free rider problem is the person doesn't do any work and still gets the average grade of how the team works.
Right.
What you really have here is a very natural way. be able to detect
right.
all that.
No, so actually Bob Sutton, my colleague, and Hagi Rao have written this book that's going to come out soon, Scaling Up Excellence. So how do you actually scale up, sort of a community or an organization and maintain high quality? And one of them, sort of that we, sort of actually kind enough to write about us. One thing that's very important for us is maintaining a culture of transparency and accountability. So when the team of students work, they rate each other, from, Anya was a no-show to, all the way she was fantastic. And then you sort of collect these ratings, and that actually turn into a reputation score. So every student, every learner has a reputation score that you can go, next time you want to form a team with somebody, you can see their ratings, you can see what endorsement they got, you can see the projects they did. So again, a lot of these are, part of the, sort of, giving learners identity, helping them, actually build a profile, helping them, build a reputation. It's done before in a lot of online systems, it's, I guess, part of the, sort of the, open learning community. What we are doing is that we try to do this in a more integrated way on a one, single platform, and also, sort of we try to, collect the data and give aggregate data to instructors so that they can actually change their lectures, assignments, the structure of their class based on the data.
I just want to,
Interesting data without tests.
yeah,
Right.
totally. I love that. I just want to submit a small objection, which is that all of this has been built by engineers, and it betrays such an engineering mindset in the sense that you guys are so excited about getting all this data, and it is totally going to define your sense of the problem space. Like, your sense of what the interesting problems are gets shaped by what you can find out, what's captured within the system and the model. And you start looking for your glasses under the street light, and there's a potential that you lose sight of the things that happen in the dark meat space, where people are gathered not with each other, but around laptops, and what's happening for them emotionally, what's happening for them with the other people that they're having a virtual relationship with, what's happening for them in their home lives. And we're not reinventing the wheel here in the sense that it should be obvious to everyone that people like to not be anonymous when they learn together, that they like to have a profile and a reputation and a sense of working together. And I think it's wonderful that your system is allowing for those things in new ways, but I just wonder about to the extent that we start to define the frontiers of learning by these amazing systems and these amazing experiences, what experience that is relevant are we going to possibly lose sight of or forget?
So you're absolutely right? Sort of, we are engineers. A lot of the decisions that we make are data-driven, and you can't measure everything by just looking at people's click behavior, right? So now we try to run surveys, ask questions, try to go actually meet them, in the meet space, as sort of to learn more. But I'm not, I'm quite aware of the fact that, sort of, there is a lot more to be learned and a lot more to be done.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a tricky question for me to answer because, the whole spirit of DML, digital media learning, which is part of the connected learning, which is this group here, has probably pioneered more ethnographic research on situated learning than any place else in the world.
Right.
And what has been missing is certain amounts of kind of massive quantitative data that complements the massive amounts of insightful ethnographic data. And so I think it's exactly a question of having a hybrid methodology. And it's been very, very hard to get, for legal reasons and not illegal reasons, pardon me, for legal reasons, to get really massive amounts of data to understand why are kids making these mistakes. And so, I mean, I think if you're really trying to build a theory of mind bugs or a theory of why are certain things fundamentally misunderstood, that's 10% ethnographic. It's probably 40, 50% understanding the practices and a little bit find those edge examples that we can actually go back in and now ask questions about. So to some extent, we're discovering the edges that then you can use a different set of eyeglasses to go back and look. So I mean, this is by no means, I don't think, one lens fits everything here at all.
Right. I mean, I am also very excited about the emergence of huge amounts of data, and I am also cautious about knowing that the things that we can't measure are the ones that we stop paying attention to very quickly. So I guess I want to, connecting, I guess, to the DML's work, I want to give you a chance, Amin, to talk about the new project that you're doing, because a very common objection that's raised to the MOOC model, and I heard it very strongly expressed recently by Dean Flores, who's the head of 20 Million Minds, which is a sort of open access opportunities type of organization. And he was talking about how, these MOOCs are designed for these, very good learners, people who are very comfortable and familiar in this space, and it's just going to multiply the digital divide times 1,000. I mean, you guys have heard this argument a million times. He said, these aren't really designed for people who are afraid of learning, or for people who are not happy learning, or for whom learning is in their lives has been an experience of failure again and again and again. Those aren't going to be the people who are most motivated to do this kind of open learning thing. So tell me how you're going to fix that.
This is easy, right?
Right away.
Right away, yeah. So there is this actually multitude of sort of answers to it. So first of all, I don't see NovoEd as a MOOC solution.
Okay.
First of all, more importantly, we offer more non-MOOC courses than MOOC courses. Now, if you go to our site, you see the MOOCs. Why? Because those are open to the public. But we actually work with a lot of universities to use the online technology to enrich the experience of the students, and also to help them expand their reach. Maybe not to 100,000, but if they have a class of 50 and they want to reach it to a class of 200, sort of, for example, we have had a course that was sort of running in one university on one campus. Now there are virtual versions of that class running in Singapore. No, I'm sorry, in Beijing, in Bangalore, in Paris, and I'm missing one, right? So it's, we actually try to experiment with all different forms of, online and blended learning. That's one. Second, right, so if you look at the first generation of MOOCs, they were designed for extremely motivated students, right? You have to be really motivated to go through this video after video, question after question, and get to the end of it. It's not a surprise 2%, 3%, or 5% of people finish these courses. I started a few and I couldn't finish. And I'm an academic. I'm supposed to have a long span of attention, commitment. I liked the subject. I knew the professors. I knew they were like my close colleagues. I liked them, and still I couldn't get through the course. Now we
get you an entrepreneur though too.
Yeah, right, there you go. So part of the reason was just the experience was very limited, right? Now we have tried to sort of add a few social components. We try to think about students' incentives, try to use the peer interaction to increase engagement, and our completion rates are actually consistently going up. We offered one course that out of the students who submitted the first homework, and that's how I measure sort of how committed you are. Typically the first homeworks are actually quite easy. 73% finished.
Wow.
So that's a very, sort of, it shows that, we really try to, make sure that technology gets out of the way. It doesn't, sort of stop you. It actually engages you. And now our next phase is to actually, one of the initiatives that I mentioned to you, and I'm quite proud of, is this collaboration with Carnegie Foundation for Advancement of Teaching to offer remedial math courses. And so Carnegie Foundation has been studying, the remedial math problem for the last few years, and they have developed this very experiential, very collaborative curriculum for teaching mathematics. And now we are, bringing that online. Carnegie has around, I think, 30 colleges that are their partners, and first those colleges are going to adopt it, and our hope is to scale this up nationally. And it's not a MOOC. It's actually supported by instructors in various colleges. Now, a very, very short version of it, we are offering fully online for anybody who wants to take it. The course is called Numbers for Life, but it's not a course that you take for credit. It's actually for someone who wants to take a look and see a different way of teaching math or a different way of learning mathematics. You can actually go to NovoEd and see the course. And we actually look at issues like mindset and for example, Carnegie Foundation did this study of a lot of the students who were taking remedial math had this very strong belief that you have to be a math person to figure this out. And then you would ask them, do you think you're a math person? And they said, no. So the first thing is that you need to go, change this, from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And then the second one is to, you teach, so you want your students to learn how to learn, right? How you can actually take advantage of online material. So it actually takes a few weeks before you start getting into any mathematics or any arithmetic. I'm actually quite excited about this. And I know it's a very difficult problem. I know it's a very challenging problem, but the startups are supposed to, attack hard problems. So we are going for this head on.
I guess it would be the ultimate revenge if science proved to us the importance of things other than science in being successful in life. Like all the neuroscience and all the underpinnings now. Angela Duckworth just got a Genius grant to study grit and perseverance. And the idea that you build a math course and you kind of start with people's confidence and their emotional attitudes is fascinating. And maybe that's what we need is more data.
Right.
E.L. Wilson has a beautiful book out, A Letter to a Young Scientist.
Oh.
And he actually argues that math education is not a good way to do STEM.
Okay.
And is arguing actually the real question is how do you generate curiosity? And that's the real game.
Mm-hmm.
And then once a kid gets curious and encounters something that he or she cares about, that may be the time to start pulling certain information in and be willing to learn certain things. And I was really struck as a now slightly older kid when I actually approached my father to say, should I take this course in differential equations? And he looked at me, he's a physicist, and he looked at me and he said, if you have to take a course in differential equations, you don't need to proceed. With the kind of, and it took me a little while to decompile what he was saying. But it was very interesting saying, when you need to learn something, learn it. But you're learning in a highly situated way. And you have an issue. So, we were talking before we started in terms of what does it mean to actually think about, kids engaging in projects? And, if you take interest-driven learning seriously, you get hooked on projects. Now, the question is, how do you hook a kid on a project? But once you get hooked on a project, then you start pulling things in, not just conceptual knowledge, but you also pull in skills. All the skills usually require mentoring. It comes back to your social networks again. How does that really work? But the thing we haven't talked about, although you were getting at a little bit in the opening comments, perhaps the thing that we're overlooking in today's world is the importance of dispositions. And dispositions can't be taught. Okay, they're cultivated. And so in a very curious way, what happens on a campus, to me, is cultivations of disposition.
How do you define a disposition?
A disposition is something that is, to use a technical term, radically indexical, meaning that it's something that, in the right context, fires up something in you. Okay, and so it's not something that's always there, but gets triggered by something, and then that gets you to then responding a certain way. That is a more or less philosophical definition of. I always hesitate to say that in front of a couple of the audience members here, but in some ways we really get confused the imparting of knowledge as a fundamental part of a campus of a university, to kind of how do you almost pick up a set of dispositions that couple into your curiosity, that give you kind of a way to know how to ask the right questions and how to pull new information in, how to actually find the kinds of peers that you want to solve things, and so on and so forth. And the curious thing is, we tend to think of it as a huge problem with the socioeconomic class of lower class learning. Okay,
Right.
I don't think there's a shred of evidence that there's any problem getting kids on the street incredibly engaged in projects. And I suggest you go back and look at that series called The Wire. Seriously, I mean, that's a more or less realistic for somebody that has come from the Chicago street like that. That's a fairly good portrayal, and those kids have a tremendous curiosity. Okay, otherwise they'd actually be dead, but that's a different problem. But there's a sense that we are born learners, and I really think it's a kind of a question of how do we begin to honor that passion to play with the environment that you are in, and something that triggers your imagination. And so I think
there is this great poem by Rumi that I'm going to botch in translation that says, don't seek water, seek thirst.
Yeah.
Once you have thirst, you will get, water will flow to you from ground and the sky.
Right.
Right? And that's actually for, if you manage, sort of instill one thing in the learner, if it's curiosity, well, then they will find the solutions themselves. Like you go to the internet, pretty much you can answer,
Right.
find answer to, and that's actually, again, sort of the biggest challenge ahead of us, right? And that's, I think, what the more traditional MOOCs are getting wrong. The actual knowledge content is becoming less and less valuable, because the actual content is, we get, there is more and more of it available, and it becomes more commoditized. It's actually the intellectual stimulation, right? That's sort of what we should look for, and we should try to find ways.
and get stuck.
Yeah.
Okay. And both of us, mentioned coming in here, kind of our hero. One of our heroes is John Dewey.
Right.
And I keep wondering at times, John Dewey was just 75 years ahead of his time.
Right.
And John Dewey, or Deweyism, we could not scale. But we may now have, not the MOOCs, but we may have tools, in social networks and things like that, and amazing tools for kids to be able to construct new tools with, to actually honor the fundamental insights of Dewey.
That's an incredible brief, I think, for action. And it requires the cultivation, as you say, of so much of what's best about people, not in a narrow sense.
Right.
The best technology, the best tools, and the best vision of what it can be, what humans can be to each other.
And I think that is our future. And I think that, it's interesting that neither of us knew that much about each other. And we walked in, we both said to each other, our hero is, and I was going to add Montessori, but Dewey is a better example for this case.
I was going to add Ivan Illich.
Pardon me?
I was going to add Ivan Illich.
Okay. Making still.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And so we haven't gotten necessarily the right balance between thinking and doing. And Dewey really kind of understood that, but we also don't have the right balance between thinking, doing, and playing. This kind of homo ludens doesn't get talked about much. We understand homo faber and homo sapien, but not homo ludens. How the three of those come together, which underlies what really makes the Dewey stuff, I think, work. And The Wire, by the way.
I think we have to throw it to the audience. That's such a beautiful note to end on, or to segue on. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for questions. Is that okay, timing? Yeah? Great. Thank you.
I'll break the ice then.
Great.
Oh, how unusual.
So this was a great discussion. So many things I could jump off of, but I wanted to return to this tension between, the dark meat space and what's visible and circulating the online space, because I think that is the critical dynamic we have to crack if we want to make the kind of learning that we believe in, the social, the human, the situational learning, really live and thrive online and in interaction with institutions, right? I mean, as John said, it's already happening in interest groups, but it's not necessarily connected to the learning and opportunity that is really going through these pathways and sites of power and changing the socioeconomic opportunity question. So I think, at the crux of this is really these measurement and assessment and visibility issues, or it's one of the really important design issues, certainly not the only one. And I'm sort of curious, I think we have a lot of great examples in interest groups and the internal metrics that communities use to develop reputation and signal expertise and things like that. And I'm just curious to hear a little bit more about whether something like collaboration or project-based work and all of those invisible things that we do to figure out who we want to work with, whether you see, in some of the work you've been doing, hope in cracking that nut and in making those metrics actually possibly as consequential as our traditional knowledge and skill-based metrics that we use in the more standard assessment toolkit.
So if I understood your question correctly, so you're saying there is a certain dynamics that takes place in sort of the real world when people work in teams and they find each other. When you go to the digital world, it's sort of you lose a lot of the you lose a lot of the signals, for example. Now, that's absolutely true, right? So by no means I'm claiming this is going to replace, in a way that Facebook is not going to replace social interaction, right? This is not going to replace any all group works or all group learning. But we were actually running this, and so we were running sort of a negotiation course where the students were supposed to negotiate against each other. And then, sort of in negotiations, there is a lot of, sort of in reading someone else, reading their, sort of signals. And then so some of, a lot of this is lost, even if you do it over Skype. And also there was this question about, collaboration when the students are doing this over, say, Google Hangout. And I talked to quite a few people, some in universities and a lot in companies. And one thing that they told me was, even if you look at the industry, a lot of this is now happening online. So, actually a lot of the negotiations that I do right nowadays, I'm doing it over email. A lot of the, sort of, if you look at, a lot of the corporations, they have teams that are across the globe, have people working, with people in different time zones and with, incomplete signals, and they're forced into teams and they have to, figure it out. So it's, so it's incomplete, but some of the skills that people learn there may actually be useful in their careers.
I mean, it is surprising to see how many major job interviews today are done, with Skype interviews.
Yeah.
And part of the question is, do we have the right social protocols to go along with that technology? I mean, teleconference either works or not works, depending on what other protocols you want to follow in terms of when you interrupt somebody and so on and so forth.
Hi, I would like to ask a practical question. I'm quite interested in venture capital, and I realized that there's a course at NovoEd, and it costs $999. It is quite expensive for me. So I would like to know, how do you set a price for a course?
Right. No, so that course is if you want to become a venture capitalist. So if you want to become a venture capitalist, $999 is not much money. If you want to actually become an entrepreneur, I recommend taking the technology entrepreneurship course. It is started last Monday, but still you can sign up, and it's free. And it's being taught by one of
I know there is a free course, but also there is a course that will cost me $999. I just want to know, how do you set the price for each courses?
So actually, the answer one is that we don't set up the prices. This course is offered by Kaufman Fellow Academy, which is a nonprofit Kaufman Fellow programs and Kaufman Foundation. They have been teaching venture capitalists and entrepreneurs for quite some time. And my best guess is that you're not the target demographics for that course, because it's actually teaching people how to become better venture capitalists and better angel capitalists. So they thought that $999 is actually a very low price for this course, because their in-person training costs between $100,000 to $200,000.
Okay, I see. Sorry, I'm not the target demographic.
So I want to ask the question as to how you are taking the stuff that you're learning within NovoEd, how that can be applied back in the more traditional environments such as we are sitting in here now, number one. Number two, broadening out from these courses which are largely oriented towards particular management entrepreneur segment to the more general problem. In particular, if I could put it bluntly, how can we promote the formation of cadres for lateral learning within large residential courses? What are you learning that will help us with that?
Right. So a lot of my colleagues who taught a course online, sort of right after when they taught the course on campus, they made some changes. Now, some of these changes were informed by the technology and by the data and the things they learned. Some of this was just because they were rethinking their course and rethinking about sort of their, we actually recommend this backward design that at the end, think about what's the last thing you want to tell the students or what you want them to say at the end of the course about what they learned, and then build your course from there. That exercise was helpful. So they, and also, there were examples where we saw, very huge dropouts from one assignment to the other assignment. So sort of, or the students were getting stuck at a particular point. And when you do this at a more massive scale, you figure out the bugs more quickly. You figure out, what parts, sort of is, is not very easy for the students to understand. So based on that, the on-campus courses improved significantly. About the last one, about this sort of, residential, we actually have a couple of pilots that are like that. They have just started, so I don't, I can answer this question a little bit better. Hopefully, let's say next, in January. But we are actually quite interested in this. So, for example, senior, sort of thesis, where some colleges, the students have to do this. Every engineering student has to do it, and they have to do it in teams. And we are sort of running this, across the engineering school, and see whether how our technology can be helpful. So,
you feel you're kind of unique in the sense that how many Coursera Udacity courses actually the professors are using this kind of operation to reflect on how to actually make their own teaching better back in.
I would say that I talked to a lot of professors that have taught MOOCs on platforms, and they all say that it changes their teaching. Just for the mere fact that they have to take their lectures that they've been very comfortably delivering to a group of undergraduates that doesn't know any better, and all of a sudden it's going to be visible to all their colleagues and people at other universities. So.
Great. Yeah. That may be the real payoff.
I mean, that's huge.
Yeah. So Tony Brick, my colleague, who actually is now the head of Carnegie Foundation, has this saying that teaching used to be this thing that happens behind closed doors in a small classrooms. And now since it has been open, we as educators have to start, thinking a little bit more, about the quality of our lectures, or whether we're getting everything right, or so that has been helpful.
Yeah, I wrote about this this week. Barry Schwartz had a piece on Slate. He teaches at Swarthmore, and he talked about TED Talks and how there are complexities being abridged and everything's being simplified. And he talked about MOOCs. The 45-minute lecture is now a 5-minute chunk. And isn't this terrible? It's great in some ways. It's terrible in other ways. Barry Schwartz himself has given several TED Talks that have had millions of views, and I have him on record saying how great it was for him to have the discipline of streamlining his message and packing it into an 18-minute package, and also delivering it to an incredible audience, a worldwide audience. So there's two sides to that coin. You do have to be briefer and sharper and maybe simpler. You can't be discursive, extemporaneous. You can't be jargony. You can't go off the way that people do in small groups of experts. But when you're teaching, that's a different mode, right?
Yeah, actually, one of my colleagues taught this course on expander graphs, which is a very specialized topic within theoretical computer science, which is on its own a very specialized topic within computer science. And I told him, if more than 500 people, take this course, I think, you publicize it too widely. But, it's just a very, very, still, I consider it, maybe, 500 people started, 400 people finished, but I consider it a great success. He called it a very long tail of MOOCs. But, the 500 people were on probably 20, 30 different countries. Right?
Wow.
So I'm just wondering how long this will remain open, because we just heard examples. Seems like it's very exclusive that you charge $1,000 for people who want to take the course but cannot. Seems to me it's really not open in a sense.
So I'm assuming this is directed to...
Yes.
So here is what, at least, I can't speak for anyone else, but here is, I can, sort of, what's my best guess, say, for NovoEd. We are going to have a lot of courses that are, around 50% of our courses that are open and free. There are, courses that are actually sort of, they have some residential component, or they have courses that have some, actually in-person instruction that are, clearly not free. And then so there are some courses that are actually our learning environment are supporting a few courses that are, Stanford charges, around $10,000 for. So if you think about, again, sort of universities like Stanford, Berkeley, or, others, I think they're going to have portfolio of courses as well. I don't anticipate all the courses of universities to become, let's say for a university like Stanford, to make all of its courses open and free. It will be always a subset of that. But the hope is to actually, move away from this and try to create a very, I don't think that sort of the whole university experience will become free sometime soon, but the hope and the goal is to actually reduce the cost substantially.
My name is Philip Schmidt. My question is also related to openness and limits to openness, but it takes a slightly different direction. Actually, started by JSB's comment about Skype interviews. I think hiring processes will change much more than having virtual conversations to be driven by data and things we can aggregate about people's activities online. And so one concern that I have is if we're doing more and more learning in these platforms that are essentially closed, right? You own the data that I leave in your platform, then the things, these achievements that I make throughout my learning history that kind of represent my story that will help me get jobs are also owned by corporations. And for me, the concept of openness would mean that we find a way to take those things out of these platforms and put them back in the hands of the individual learner. So I'm sorry that this isn't a real question, but I would love some reactions or just thoughts on this general notion of openness and closed
Right, so
with
I
respect
can't
to
speak
data.
for everybody. On NovoEd, you own the user-generated content. It's actually in our terms of service. Now, by posting it on NovoEd, you give us a license to show it, but it doesn't mean that you are transferring ownership to us. It's this sort of, I would say it's similar for sites like, GitHub, that, nowadays when we want to hire a programmer, we will look at their portfolio on GitHub. And these are the source codes that they have uploaded. I don't think, I think they are still the owner of that, the owner of the code they have uploaded, so.
Sure. So just to follow on this,
Yeah.
I'm not so worried about the contributions that I make, but the data that you are aggregating about me, the things that you learn about my activities that you could represent to employers, right? Which is, for example, what Stack Exchange does very well. I still own my posts on Stack Exchange, but the aggregate data that Stack Exchange has on my behavior, my reputation, they're marketing that to employers in the same way that you could market information about me to employers.
Right. So again, it's part of our terms of service. We don't sell information to potential employers without the explicit permission of our users.
But some MOOC platforms do, and they're
Again, as I said, I'm
yeah.
not speaking for, but we are actually pretty careful. So, it's, we have already committed this to our users that we don't do this.
And, as you well know, take a movement like ID3, ID cubed, we're looking at, how to construct a new layer, new protocol layer on top of the net, but then actually let you control what happens with that data. And that's a very strong technical movement with, Sandy, et cetera, Pendleton and John Clippinger. I think down the hall from you, actually. Yeah. But I think we have to get back to issues like that because, we could tell horror stories about what's going to happen if we don't get on top of this problem.
So, given all this wild learning out there that JSB touched upon when we talked about World of Warcraft, but I think everybody knows when you want to learn to do something, usually there's a 14-year-old on YouTube who's going to tell you how to do it. I just wondered, all of the discussions about all of what's being opened up by the technology, there is an assumption that the container is a course. And I just wonder what's out there in the wild blue yonder other than course.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. We see this already. Like, we offer these courses that supposedly start in September and end in December, but you log in 6 months after, and you see still, the students are on. They're still working. They're still collaborating. They're still exchanging messages. This notion of, there is this transition from, sort of universities, and then there are a lot of, the structures that are being imposed, but I don't think they are going to survive in this new war. So the notion of course, the notion of lecture, they are going to be changing. For example, another thing that we don't offer is, 10-week, 14-week courses anymore. Typically our more successful courses are much shorter, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks.
I also think that you may have some of these short courses that prime the pump, but I actually think you're going to find where I think both you and I came from some time ago, that if you take projects seriously, take communities of interest seriously, you engage in a cognitive apprenticeship to a community of interest that you want to, and through that process you pick up the skills. And so I want to separate, again, knowledge, content, skills, and dispositions. Skills are mentored in these types of communities of interest. And I think you're going to find that you start to build trajectories through these types of projects. And I don't think you're going to have, in a world of constant change, what we really moved into is a world in which the half-life of most skills has collapsed to 5 years. That means that you better damn well find kind of an adventure picking up new stuff. And you're going to pick these things up, engaged in activities you care about. And it's apprenticeship, cognitive apprenticeship especially, has worked amazingly well. And none of us would have picked up our even natural language without that. So, we are inveterate learners, and we're not necessarily engineered to be inveterate receivers of prepackaged information.
I loved the comments that you all had about, and I might be not phrasing it exactly right, but the university or maybe college experience, the value, a lot of it being in the intellectual stimulation rather than the content. And that kind of reminded me that whenever I think about this, I see this huge issue that's kind of lurking invisibly about basically what do we think an education is, or what do we think it should be. And to me, should is not a word I really like a lot in this kind of thing, but if I ask, where do we think the value of an education is? And then once you say that, the value to who, right? And because that can split it into a lot of different things. And I don't think it's, oh, there we go. I don't think it's fair to ask you to answer that question right here, but maybe you could speak to who you think is, has some outstanding things to say about that or is really working on it in a great way.
I mean, we both are address that. The thing I find encouraging is there are presidents of some very august universities that for the first time are asking deeply that question. Mm-hmm. And I think, I think it's back on the table. It was not a legitimate question 2 years ago. Mm. And so I think that, and I think that, in fact, if we don't answer that, we won't be able to do cost justification for these tier 1 schools. And there is in my terminology, there's a sense of cultivation that really happens. I could talk a lot on that, but why don't you say something?
All right, so actually I have this great quote from one of my colleagues who said, learning is what you take with you when you forget the material. We are actually, the way I actually try to remember this, they call it 4 C's, the, 21st century skills, the, collaboration, communication, creativity, and critical thinking. These are the, the 4 things that we try to, always, measure our courses against and see whether, now these are at the same time very hard to measure, but we try to come up, to see whether our courses are going to further students in these dimensions. When it comes to college experience, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So actually, universities have to start thinking about what are they about? Are they about research, about teaching? Are they nice grass and a football field? And which ones are being disrupted and disintermediated? And,
what I find most exciting about this moment is how many people are answering that for themselves. I mean, the whole phenomenon of someone deciding, say a young computer programmer who's been unschooled his entire life and has theories about paired programming and how people should interact respectfully when they're learning to program. And he started this program called Hacker School, and it's totally funded by the companies that pay $10,000 a head for people that they hire out of the program. So it's free for people to attend. Yeah. That's a totally new model that didn't exist 4 years ago and is totally viable to do today.
So I just want to reflect on your beautiful opening quote a moment ago, because, it's, let me call it, it's a cute quote, but what I find now is now couple that to the observation that the half-life of much of our knowledge and our skills is down to 4 or 5 years.
Right.
Then your statement now becomes even more forceful, in why it's what what's left behind. It's the residue of doing this.
Right. So, if I go back to John Dewey, here sort of, he said that, sort of education is not what prepares you for life. It's like, it's becoming more and more true nowadays.
Right, precisely.
Hi. What I'm chewing on is your explanation of reputation scores. And I'm thinking about that classic example of when a musician, let's say a cellist, goes behind a screen and the board decides who should be first chair. And the person who they choose is often not the person who they would have chosen in an open, non-screened exam. It might be the overweight guy, or it might be the woman, the people who they thought aren't typically suited for first chair. So I'm thinking about what other factors influence reputation scores. If you know if a peer has a female name or a name related to a certain race, religion, ethnicity. I'm thinking about how this might reproduce discrimination and social bias, that we're not necessarily walking into a vacuum. And I'm also thinking about whether this might reproduce educational tracking and label people in ways that might negatively or positively reinforce, encourage or discourage engagement. But I'm also wondering if it could reframe from excellence in some sort of exam, that grade that might be fallaciously tied to beliefs about ability, to being more about effort and behavior, more about that growth mindset, which we know is inherently more motivating. So I'm conflicted about reputation scores, and I wonder if you might bounce off of that a bit. Thank you.
No, so you're absolutely right. So some of the social biases that exist, so they do exist in sort of real life. Some of them will be reflected in the sort of its digital projection, in its digital image. Now, in order to reduce that and to avoid that, we try to ask very concrete questions. It's not like how much did you like that person? It's that did they show up to the meeting? They do the part that was assigned to them. And typically, when you ask your questions like that, you will get better answers. So those are the steps that we are taking to try to avoid biases. Now, actually, it's actually a topic of research. We had this game theory course where the students played various games against each other, like Prisoner's Dilemma or Divide the Dollar. And some of them, single shot or multiple rounds. And actually, the data is available, and there are people doing research to see the effect of culture or the effect of whether you're playing the game against someone in your country or from your culture or not. So it's actually could be a great avenue for research as well.
I mean, by the way, the twist I would put on that is that we're now finding, as we move more toward this sense of what do kids build in one form or another? I mean, perform, do, projects, okay? Then what happens is you evaluate that person by having them show you the project. Okay, now some of those projects are collaboratively done, so it's a little bit more complicated, but it's kind of, in some sense, assessing the output and then how they talk about it. And so that gets around some of the problems you're talking about, and that's one of the reasons why we're looking more and more, I think, with some of these new tools of kind of like, what have you done with it? And even show me a course you have built, and then evaluate it. I mean, so I think that we're actually now, unlike in the past, actually have a better chance than ever to look at output measures, not just input or, in-process measures.
Hi, thank you so much for the really rich discussions. My name is Nishant Shah, and I had a couple of questions, and let me try and frame them really quickly. I'm very curious about what you think about the permanence of records when it comes to MOOCs, right? And it works both ways as instructors, because anybody who now does even, like talks on a regular basis, you already know that you never say everything you want to say in one talk because it's going to be recorded on YouTube, and so you need to make sure that everything is like distributed so that on your YouTube channel you have 16 talks which finally make the full argument, which is not how pedagogy necessarily works, right? In classrooms, I often ask students not to record what's being said because the classroom has to be a space where what runs here called the information without signature. There has to be a space for things to be said which cannot be attributed right back at you because that's what provokes learning in certain ways. And I'm wondering how kind of technology platforms can deal with it where everything is a record. And you kind of contrast it with perhaps pushing Philip's question around openness a little bit. And say when you talk about open governance, for instance, there is a very clear idea that openness is not only about control and manipulation of my own data, but also about a right to be forgotten, right, at some point? You need to forget what I said because otherwise I will always be held responsible for it. And that's one of the privileges of a classroom, is that you are allowed to say really stupid things because you need to get it out of your system first. And I don't know how MOOCs deal with it, and I don't know what impact this has in terms of online and collaborative learning, because I just want to make a distinction saying resolution often is that you get to iterate what you have said, right? And that's the way out of it. But sometimes you don't even want to let somebody know that you began with that particular draft, and how do we kind of deal with it? It might be an interesting question to just throw off.
So we need a Snapchat for MOOCs.
So let me play with that a second. I think it's a fabulous type question. Some of us are engaged in kind of a form of science fiction where you do world building. It's a very interesting topic. How do you envision a world in which there's a half-life to what you've just said, of all data concerning you, which, by the way, solves some bullying problems and a lot of other things. But I mean, it's a very interesting, there's a little book out called Delete that actually looks at that from a theoretical point of view. But, you know, it's interesting, one of the major world-building exercises is Minority Report, which is precog, which goes the other way. It'd be very interesting to construct a world going the other way. And to kind of play that out in our imagination and see what that might mean. I think it'd be a fabulous thing.
I think we have one. You had a question for a while. Yeah. Oh, sorry. We've got 2 last questions.
2.
Okay. Yeah. Is that okay?
Okay. So my question quickly is, looking with regular classes in MOOCs, you have regular classes where you have an in-person teacher, and then MOOCs where most of it is online. I'm wondering whether we have experience with different levels of assistance that students receive, and whether we have any information now about types of assistance maybe short of a full class in a university that might be effective in helping students get through classes.
We have done some experiments there. I think that actually Udacity has done more extensive experiments in that domain, that they have introduced, I think, online tutors, and there was a chat line that the students could go and ask questions. And now for their computer science degree, they have this, I don't remember the official name, but it was some form of a course teaching assistant that wasn't teaching assistant.
I think it's like an undergraduate. This is the Georgia Tech.
Yes.
It's like an undergraduate who's a year ahead, or they've completed that course with honors, and then they're sort of a peer TA, which is borrowed from the National Center for Academic Transformation.
Right.
The peer
so,
TA.
Yeah. So they have done more experiments. We do have actually this notion of community TAs that from one course they got, but you know, this is like probably 10 community TAs for a community of tens of thousands. So yeah, obviously there needs to be more experiments there. Now, given that, for example, Udacity is actually, these new courses will not be free, so you will be paying for the degree, they will actually be able to hire people and experiment in that.
But also consider Khan Academy and the flipped instruction model, and that's being played out in all kinds of different ways. So there may be quite a distribution of ways to get some new data on that.
So David's taking host prerogative to insert a quick question, then we'll end up front.
Thank you for a very rich conversation. I just want to put into play sort of, in the conversation the tension between the qualitative and the quantitative in relation to aspects of learning itself, right? So just as not every lecture is conducted in the same way in relation to different domains, so there's a tendency, even a worry about technology imposing singularity of models on the way learning takes place. Different domains have different dispositions towards learning. So, the classic one would be humanities having a different way of engagement in the conversational and the dialogic and so on than, say, a computer science course, right? So I just want to worry aloud a bit about leaving open the sorts of heterogeneities of the way in which learning takes place.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. The first generation of MOOCs was, clearly designed by computer scientists for computer scientists. Right? It was absolutely clear. Now, I had the unusual sort of fortune of being in a non-computer science department where the courses were taught very experientially, so we tried to scale that up. We are now looking into, say, writing courses and sort of novel writing, even, and finding the best way of, adopting technology to scale up that pedagogical model. But we are, far, far away from, sort of understanding and sort of, developing enough knobs and levers where every instructor can design their course using those tools the way they want.
But there are, let me tell you, some edge cases being developed that you'd be very interested in. Michael Sandel's course on justice is a pure Socratic method. We're now, I'm doing some work with a small company with him. We're now teaching, that's now being taught globally, simultaneously. And we're now having Socratic dialogue between multiple students from multiple countries about ethical issues. And you really gotten to see, it's just stunning to see the kinds of things that happen when students start arguing with other students about justice and ethics.
Hi, going back to the hybrid model, a lot of this conversation has been about higher education, about MOOCs, but my company did a pilot program teaching cyber civics to middle school students for preventative measures behind the tools, balance and identity and reputation and things like that, to teach them early on, peer-to-peer learning, how to do that. And this program, so far, it's been done in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. In the beginning, the school had 10 to 12, it's a fairly small school, but 10 to 12 cyber incidences per quarter, and they have had 0 since this program has been put into place. And in addition, the academics have increased. They've been increasing in the rankings in their district academically, and we're trying to figure out how to measure that social, emotional measurement of preventative behaviors equal improved academics. And I was wondering if you've done any of that or can suggest some ways to achieve that.
Congratulations on your success. That's for.
Well, it's a small, hybrid school, and now we're trying to roll it out, and we want to figure out how to assess that properly.
Yeah, no, I'm not
Okay.
aware of any references.
Pretty darn important stuff.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fantastic note to wrap up this evening's discussion with. I think this has been a great kickoff and conversation, and really appreciate, too, the folks on the live stream and a pretty lively Twitter chat on the Reclaim Open hashtag. So I encourage everybody on the internet to continue the party there. We will be moving into the lobby, into dark meet space for a while to party on here. But
physical drinks?
I think that image is going to stay with us throughout this event. But anyway, please join me in thanking our panelists. This was really fantastic.
Thank you.